It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Great Northern Stop Brexit Conference. My name is Richard Wilson. I'm the chair of Leeds for Europe, who have organised this event. Thank you all for coming. But I do want to explain a bit about why we have organised this conference and what we're hoping to achieve from it. There is great work going on across the country to persuade the British people and politicians that firstly we should be given a vote, the people's vote, on the terms of the final Brexit deal, including the option to remain in the EU. But secondly, of course, and most importantly, we need to make sure this second vote doesn't turn out the same way as the other one did in 2016. The good news is, I think, that the People's Vote campaign is starting to get traction in the public, in the media, and in Parliament, and this is obviously essential if we're going to stop Brexit. However, we mustn't kid ourselves that even if we win a future referendum, it will be enough to settle this issue. If the margin of victory for Remain is as narrow as the vote for Leave was in 2016, then the Brexiters will not accept it. The toxin of Brexit will continue to circulate around the bloodstream of the United Kingdom and British politics for years, possibly decades to come. I think we need to win this vote convincingly, and I think we need to win by offering voters a positive programme of change and not just by bombarding them with relentless negativity about how awful Brexit is, because a lot of Leave voters have frankly stopped listening to that message. I'm saying that based on the experience that I and the rest of the Leeds for Europe team have gained from campaigning in the streets of West Yorkshire over the last 2 years. We've spoken to literally thousands of people, and I hope it doesn't sound arrogant if I say that I suspect there aren't many groups of people, perhaps present company accepted, who have more experience of talking to ordinary people over a prolonged period of time about Brexit. We're particularly well placed because the city of Leeds was about as evenly divided as anywhere in the country in 2016, so we're exposed to the full spectrum of opinion. In all that time, there is one response which comes up time and again from people who still believe in Brexit, which is almost impossible for us to counter. We can be explaining how the tariff and non-tariff barriers will lead to delays in the supply chain, which will cause industries to have to stockpile their materials and cause prices in the shops to rise and lead to job losses for their children. We can beat them on the arguments and on the facts. We've won the argument, really, so it seems, but then they just come back with a killer comment and they say, "We just want to leave. We just want to leave." That comment is coming from deep down inside them, and no amount of rational argument will shift them. They've heard it all about how awful Brexit is going to be, how we will lose access to the single market, how there'll be a price to pay for Brexit. They just don't care because they just want to leave. For them, it's a matter of the heart, not the head. What I am nervous about is if all we do is talk about how complicated Brexit is, how badly it's being handled, how it's too difficult, how we should just give up on it. What we often do is simply feed the frustration of these people. They feel that they're being bamboozled, and they feel that clever people are trying to throw obstacles in their path. This actually makes them more, not less, fanatical in their support for Brexit. So I think we need to adapt our approach. To do this, we need to remind ourselves how Leave got more votes than Remain in 2016, when a few weeks before the referendum, all the polls showed a comfortable and consistent majority in favour of remaining in the EU. What the Leave campaign did was essentially to ignore real facts and evidence and go straight for an emotional response. Ultimately, there was a surge of support for leaving the EU during the course of the campaign, and the effects of that upsurge in nationalism and outright xenophobia and racism are still with us today. Take back control was, of course, the oft-repeated slogan, which probably got them over the line. When we get another referendum, we need our own surge of support for the European ideal. We need our own version of take back control. We need to make people feel as emotional about staying in the European Union as the die-hard leavers felt about leaving it. How do we make people fall in love with being Europeans again? Well, that's one of the themes that we're here to talk about today. And for starters, I just want to make a few suggestions. How about peace? How about we talk about peace? Isn't that something to feel emotionally attached to? Why do we hardly ever talk about it? Isn't it the most staggeringly wonderful achievement of the European Union? Why are we talking endlessly about tariffs and non-tariff barriers when we should be talking about the fact that no countries in the EU have entered into military confrontation for 70 years after centuries of almost constant conflict? And how about we talk about freedom? Everybody values freedom. People should be angry about having their freedom of movement curtailed. I am. Let's remind voters what it means for them, their children, their grandchildren, to be able to live, settle, work and study in 27 other countries without restriction. And what about democracy? I'm fed up of being told that the EU is undemocratic. It is quite simply a lie. It is thanks to the EU that democracy has spread across our continent, from Spain and Portugal in the 1970s to Romania and Bulgaria in the 2000s. We elect our MEPs, and all the important decisions about the EU are taken by our own elected governments at the Council of Ministers. Quite frankly, we should stop being on the back foot on these issues and start assertively making these arguments. The strapline for today's conference is creating a vision of a new Britain without Brexit. This is important because I think it's imperative that when the people's vote comes, we on the Remain side are the ones offering the positive vision of how the future could be, as compared with the dismal prospects for our people in Brexit Britain. Our argument must be, look at all the great things we could do for this country if we weren't doing Brexit. We understand that people voted for change. Recommitting to membership of the EU will enable us to make the change that you voted for, and we are full of ideas about what needs to be done. We must be the ones with exciting ideas about reducing inequality, closing the north-south divide, investing in housing, transport and our health service, and reforming our democracy. The Brexiters, on the other hand, can offer nothing but petty nationalism and the prospect of national decline. I hope that gives you some food for thought. One day, of course, is not enough to solve a problem like Brexit, but let's do what we can. I hope you'll continue these discussions outside the conference hall. For those who tweet, today's hashtag is Brexit North. Please use it and engage with those outside the hall if you can, and continue the discussion after you leave in your communities, online and offline, and your local media, and with your elected representatives. So, a few brief words about the format for today. We will hear in a moment from our first keynote speaker, and then we will have our first panel session on the Northern Power Failure. We'll then break for lunch, about 12:30. After lunch, we then split into two parallel sessions, which you can see on the programme. One's in here, and one's in the room on the right as you come into the hotel. After those two sessions, there'll be a coffee break, and then we will all come back in here for the final stretch of the day. Most of the sessions are going to be in a question time format with a brief series of opening comments from the panellists, and then we try and get the audience to ask as many questions, make as many points as we can in the time available. So we want to keep it as interactive as possible, but we are very strict in terms of time. We don't want to go on too long or we'll be here all night, so we have to cut it off at the end of each time zone. So let's make a start with our first guest speaker of the day. Will Hutton is one of my favourite journalists and economists, and I am so delighted that he has agreed to join us here today. Will started his journalistic career at the BBC, where he worked for 10 years, being the economics editor of Newsnight between 1983 and 1988. He then spent 4 years as editor-in-chief at The Observer newspaper, which he still writes for, before becoming chief executive of the Work Foundation. He's currently principal of Hertford College, Oxford. Will has written a number of books on economics and politics, one of his first and best known being The State We're In, Why Britain is in Crisis and How to Overcome It. And that was in 1995. If only they had listened to him then. His most recent book, written jointly with Lord Adonis, is Saving Britain, How We Must Change to Prosper in Europe. I would thoroughly recommend that if you haven't read it already. If you have read it, I think you will understand why Will Hutton is the perfect person to open our conference. Please extend a warm welcome to Will Hutton.
Wow, thank you very much. Thank you. I think the next 10 weeks are the most important in our lives. In a way, we begin our book, Andrew and I, by saying Brexit Britain was right. The status quo is insupportable, but the answer was never to blame the European Union. The issues, the alchemy of distress that caused so many people to vote to leave the European Union, particularly actually in parts of Yorkshire, were firmly minted in the UK. By us, we can change them. One of the things I want to discuss this morning is how that programme has to sit alongside the campaign we're going to mount to persuade millions of people to change their mind, and if we get this vote, back the case for remaining in the EU. I hope sincerely that happens in the next 10 weeks. We have this referendum, this second people's vote, and we win it and we stop the process. If not, on March the 29th, I flip from being a Remainer to a returner. Hope you do too. But it's not just a question, this, of what's happening here in Britain. I like to characterize Brexit like the European Reformation, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, the world wars we fought for Christ's sake, as a European phenomena. Brexit is our version, the Alternative for Deutschland, unashamedly Nazi party, now being number 2 in the opinion polls in Germany, just recently topping the SPD. It's our version of the Swedish Democrats. It's our version of the Freedom Party in Austria. It's our version of Mr. Salvini in Italy. It is our version of a right-wing, populist nativism, fear of immigration, feeding on economic and social distress that has made working-class communities around our continent vote against the status quo represented by the European Union. We have to recognize, both here in Britain and in Europe, that what is happening is a challenge to the things that have actually made us prosperous, made us peaceful, that the issues that actually people are protesting about are ones that national communities... Can you hear me still? I can see someone with a... let me do this. I'll stand my... Can you hear me better? I'm going to pop a bit, but I'll do that. I'm tall, so consequently the mic is a bit further away from my mouth than it was over Richard's. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a European phenomena. And what I want to do just in the few minutes that I've got, I want to describe why I think the Brexit vote happened. I want to talk a bit about immigration and how we've got to have something to say about that. I want to put what I think are the main elements of a reform programme, and I want to encourage all of us to talk in really inspiring language about Europe. It's a fantastic, noble project. It is the means to be peaceful, prosperous, but actually for all of us to live lives we have reason to value. There is no future in regressing this country to becoming a right-wing island, closed to the rest of the world, the vision of Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson. We have to fight for something different. So, why the Brexit vote? Well, one of the things that I was really struck by in looking at this is actually just how much social distress there is in our country. England boasts 7 of the poorest regions in Northern Europe. 7 of the poorest regions in Northern Europe. The 8th is in Northern Ireland, the 9th is in Wales. But we English are poor. Those regions have per capita incomes scarcely higher than the poorest states in the United States, like Mississippi, or the poorest countries in Eastern Europe, like Romania and Bulgaria. People suffer from what American doctors call shit life syndrome. Antidepressants are prescribed, in Blackpool, for example, antidepressants are prescribed for 330 out of 1,000 adults in Blackpool. Stunning numbers. Life expectancy in these poor English regions is stagnating, and actually in the last 2 years begun to decline. We now have gaps in life expectancy in the poorest and richest wards in some of our towns and cities around the country of up to 16 or 17 years. The life chances of someone born the wrong side of the tracks are just so much worse than those of us who, for one reason or another, are lucky enough to get skilled, get a degree, get a professional qualification, or live in one of the metropolitan centres of the country, Leeds, London, Liverpool, Manchester, not in the outlying towns. Those outlying towns voted Brexit by overwhelming majorities. Nearly every town in England with less than 250,000 people voted for Brexit. The social mobility cold spots identified by the Social Mobility Commission, 30 of them, all 30 of them, those are areas where, whatever age you are, your chances of even making the kind of money that you can on average, in an average job on average incomes are just don't exist. You're not trained, you're not educated, the prospects aren't there. Every single one of them voted for Brexit. With life expectancy falling, with mobility non-existent, with life chances as they were, people wanted to give those of us in the prosperous parts of the country a well-aimed kick in the rump. They wanted to vote against the status quo, represented by the European Union. Some of the things that I came across in my researches for this book really took me back. You may know some of this, I didn't. I didn't know that the sales of DIY dental equipment, dental kit, where you self-administer the anesthetic and self-administer the filling, are booming. We don't have a national dental service. One of the biggest rows I got into when I was campaigning in Oxford was with people who said they were going to vote for Brexit because they wanted a dental service in Oxford. I now know why. But there's other and more ghastly things to think about. I learnt yesterday, this is a statistic that I was wondering about whether to put in front of you, but nonetheless it gives you some index of the kind of fragmented social contract, the evisceration of our welfare system in an environment where by 2020, the spending on public services per capita since 2010 will have fallen by a quarter. We now have something of an epidemic of, and this is a really tough thing to say, wait for it, but there's the putrefied corpses of old single people who've died alone, unnoticed by neighbours, unpicked up by social care, is booming. That's what's happening in Left Behind, England in particular, and they want to change. And if we're going to win this vote, and I want to win it big, we have to make the case for Europe, because in two contexts. One, it is Europe and the European Union which actually will permit us the framework to grow, to raise the taxes and present the opportunities that actually allow us to spill prosperity and a better social contract into the places in our country that are so neglected. We have to make that argument. And we also have to make the argument, don't worry about not being in control of your borders. We have an answer for that too. Join us in an inspiring mission to reinvent our country and in the process reinvent our Europe and not actually break out of this terrible vortex in which we are locked. And anyone who thinks that Jacob Rees-Mogg, Liam Fox, Ian Duncan Smith, Michael Gove, and the rest of them have these kind of considerations front of mind when they make the case for Brexit really need their heads examining. So, what do? These problems are firmly minted at home. We need a really powerful program of reform to address them. And we campaigners to stay in the European Union, as we stand on doorsteps, stand behind stalls, and make the case with our friends and our families, need to say these things and also say things about Europe, which I'll come to in a second. I think we have to accept that, and I think it's really an important statement to make, that the capitalism in which we live in 2018 has reached the end of the road. We live in a value-extracting rather than a value-creating capitalism. Artificial intelligence, the rise of robots, the rise of dense concentrations of digital power like Google and all the rest are going to make matters worse, not better. I think, please buy the Observer tomorrow, you read me opining about the risk of there being a second financial crisis. The question of how to reform our capitalism and reform our economy alongside it, which is the same thing, of course, has become never more urgent, never more pressing. And actually sailing off out of the European Union into an alleged free market paradise in which we can regulate our trade or not regulate it through actually the crumbling and about to collapse World Trade Organization in the face of this challenge to reform capitalism is an act of self-harm on an epic, epic scale. So, what have we got to do? Well, I think we have to have a Marshall Plan to train our people. I think it's a disgrace that of 800,000 kids that are born every year in our country, 350,000, 400,000 will get the GCSEs and A-levels that will carry them to university. What happens to the other half? The training system for them is actually close to non-existent. It's an alphabet soup of skills which are often not worth having and which employers know aren't worth having. That has to change. We have to empower our people in the workplace. We have to find ways of reinventing working class institutions that have withered on the vine over the last 30 years. That's one thing to do. Huge program alone. Second, we have to have companies that actually believe in what they do, are owned around delivering a purpose, that actually want in one way or another to do great things. We want value-creating companies, not value-extracting companies, a total overhaul of company law. We've got to challenge digital power. We need a social contract that actually does do what's required for everybody at every stage in their lives in a 21st century environment. We have to say to the voters, Labour voters in particular, in Yorkshire constituencies who are voted Leave because they wanted a better world for their grandchildren, to say to them emphatically, we hear you and we understand why you say that, and this is what we're going to do on housing, this is what we're going to do on health, this is what we're going to do on dentistry, We don't want people living in cramped houses with crap diets, where food banks are exploding. We have to marry the case for Europe with a case for change. We have to say that we are apostles of great work. We have to say that we are apostles of lowering inequality, that it is intolerable that in parts of Yorkshire, after 100 years, life expectancy is falling. But that is not the fault of the European Union. It is not the fault of the European Union that a class of directors and people at the top of our company sector are being paid 3, 4, 5 times more in relation to average earnings than they were 30, 40 years ago. Some of them creating dynastic fortunes and running companies that actually aren't creating wealth, but displacing monumental amounts of risk onto the shoulders of ordinary working people. That's not Europe's fault. Indeed, actually, with instruments like the Working Time Directive and other initiatives, it's tried to mitigate the blow. If only anybody had known. Not Europe's fault. And lastly, we have to reconfigure our financial system. Now, look, that's a far cry from, you might think, from actually your passion to stay in the European Union. But I think we have to make these things, we have to hold them close, those propositions, because we need to understand why so many people voted against the status quo. But above all, we have to recognize that interdependence between public and private. We can make that argument too. But we also have to say something about immigration. We have to be able to say, again, I mean, some of the Bradford, Rochdale, you know the names of the places. So many towns around the country, especially smaller towns, were really fearful of immigration. 17 of the 23 front pages of the Daily Mail, under the editorship of Paul Dacre, had front-page stories about immigration in the run-up to the vote on June the 23rd, and not one of them was genial. Boston, in Lincolnshire, became a poster child for what could happen to you if you lived in Rochdale, if you lived in Knowsley, if you lived in Stoke, if you lived in Chatham, if you lived in Colchester. It was coming to you. Avalanche of foreigners, swollen by a kind of Islamic terrorists coming in via Mrs. Merkel's open door policy in Germany. We're going to take your jobs away, lower your incomes, and change British identity. Nigel Farage played that card brutally. He played it hard, and at the margin, it was the difference between winning and losing. We can't allow that to happen to us again. We have to say not only the facts, which are that immigration is good, that we benefit hugely, that the people who come work massively, they come to work here, they contribute taxes, the impact on wages in all but a few hotspots, like, unfortunately, Boston. But apart from that, the impact on wages can hardly be measured. And here's the point. We British have a fantastic record of shaping our migrants. Our migrants become British alongside us and help us become a diverser, a richer, and more fabulous country. As soon as you... And the polling evidence is, and the focus group evidence is, that when you start to talk that language, actually even dyed-in-the-wool UKIP voters start to mitigate their anti-immigrant stance. I think we do need some help from the European Union in this. I would like an emergency break to be coupled with that statement. But I'd also, as I did it, I'd like to say to people, kind of celebrate our immigrants, and celebrate, in particular, you can celebrate our Islamic immigrants. Think of Mo Farah, a Great Britain winning fabulous races for us. He's as British as us. Come on. We have to make that case. I think we also, have to make the case, and Richard makes this case in his op-eds and in his speeches, and I entirely and totally agree. We have to remake our democracy here in our islands. It's a dysfunctional democracy. How dysfunctional has been demonstrated by the events of the last 2 years. It was meant to be an advisory referendum. It's become, the will of the people, which can never, apparently, be gainsaid. You know, we can have regular general elections. You can even have a second general election after 6 or 9 months if you don't get a majority in the House of Commons. But we can't have a second people's vote, can we? Because the will of the people has spoken and is inviolable and can never, ever change. Is that democracy? Precisely. Democracy is an ongoing, permanent conversation in which we, the people, are making our minds up in the light of events, changing our minds perhaps, and instituting change from our legislators who are responsive to us. There's not a moment in time, June the 23rd, 2016, which is a decision taken for all time or for another generation, which can never be challenged. Now we know what Brexit looks like. Because here's the point. I argue for an elected second chamber. It should be located in the north of England. No question. No question. I would locate our Supreme Court here in Leeds, actually. Leeds is a great legal centre. Why not have it here? It only takes 2 hours to get here from London, 2 hours to get here from Edinburgh. We can make it, Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool should be linked by HNS3, a new centre of gravity politically and economically in our islands. No question that should be what we're doing, and no question there should be absolutely much more taxing, planning, spending decisions delegated to towns and local authorities around our country. We want to re-empower our people. They said, Boris Johnson, take back control. I want real control for real communities around the country in which I live. Constitutional reform is again an essential part of the pro-European message, and we do that in Britain. That is our decision. It's got nothing to do, except it will enhance the European Union, but we don't have to ask fellow Europeans for permission to do that. We can change our constitution ourselves. I also want us to start making a proactive, positive case for Europe. That's fine. But I want us to talk about Europe. Yes, let's talk about it instrumentally, but let's also have a poetry about it. The instrumentality about Europe is actually there for all to see. It's worth saying this. I'm not going to take more than a minute or two on it, but I don't think it's right to dismiss it. The world is at a critical juncture in 2018, in autumn 2018. I mentioned earlier that the World Trade Organization, Mr. Donald Trump wants the United States, he is considering leaving the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is not a coherent kind of institution. It can't even agree whether the Doha round of trade talks begun in 2001 to try and create a freer market in services has actually finished yet. There are so much confusion. It is fragmented into groups of countries. It has no power of enforcement. It has no adjudication power. All it can do is to recommend that countries follow its processes. It is actually a toothless tiger. The only system, the only pillar of world trade growth, and by the way, whether you're talking about ancient times, you're talking about the Industrial Revolution, there's been no growth in economies without growth in trade. Growth in trade is the indispensable kind of quid pro quo for growth in our economies. The place which holds the world trade system together is the European Union. The 27 member states, excluding us, we were the 28th, and the 30 countries with whom it's got free trade agreements, and the 31 countries with whom it's negotiating free trade agreements, that constitutes 88 countries in all. That's half the world's GDP. That's more than half the world's trade. That is where free trade, rules-bound, with adjudication process, is undertaken in 2018. Most of Yorkshire and Humberside's exports go to the EU for that reason. It is of elemental fatuity to think that you can replace that with either trade deals with Taiwan, Venezuela, or whoever. It is even more fatuous to think that that sweetie pie, make American great again, Trump, is about to do a kindly trade deal with us in the United States, us in the UK, or that President Xi, another kindly person who's just made himself lifetime president of China, that these men are going to do sweetheart deals with us. They see us coming, they're going to drive the hardest of bargains, they're going to screw us, and we won't have the European Union on our side. This could not be a more self-defeating moment to make such a step. Over and above that, the European Union is the global standard setter. And here's something. Between 2009 and 2015, who wrote most of those global standards? Who wrote more than 90% of what were to become global standards? Do you know who it was? It was us. We set, Britain had become, via its membership of the European Union, the global standard setter. And company after company around the country has benefited hugely from that. Vodafone, for example, could not have become one of the biggest companies in Europe, paying 1 out of 8 pounds of dividends in the London Stock Exchange, swelling your pension fund, most of you, if it hadn't been, as they say, for the fact of European Union membership and for the fact they were able to use their standards, became European standards, became global standards. We throw that away to do a trade deal with Taiwan. How mad is that? And how mad is that when we know the challenge that we've got to reconfigure our capitalism because of the issues I described earlier. We need trade growth as a background in which we grow our economy, to raise the taxes, to build the social contract we need to make, so there is a universal dental system, so that distressed working class people in Rochdale don't have to self-administer anesthetics because there's no dental service. That is the process of thought I want you to get out and sell to people. It's as simple as that. We need the European Union to sustain the kind of reforms we want to make at home. But above all, I want to make the case for Europe as a noble thing. That actually this country has always been, and because of geography, because of who we are, where we live, has always been necessarily a European country. Elizabeth I spoke 6 languages taught by a pupil of Erasmus. The Industrial Revolution was generated by French and German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese coming into England as it was then open to immigrants to fire up our ideas and launch the Industrial Revolution. Shakespeare's plays are populated by references to Italian, French, Belgian, dukes, kings, the Merchant of Venice. Think on. We've been involved in world wars. It was Winston Churchill who said, Europe is where the weather comes from. And he wasn't thinking of cold and fronts. He was thinking of the political weather. It remains where the weather comes from. It matters to us in Britain that Putin is doing what he's doing. It matters to us in Britain that Alternative for Deutschland is the second biggest party in opinion polls in Germany. It matters to us that Europe is being convulsed by nativism and populism of the type that we can recognize because we've seen it with UKIP and what's happened to us. And we have to make common cause with the best of the people in our continent now to check these events, to make the case for something better. And here's Macron, Emmanuel Macron, talking about Europe in a big speech he made at the Sorbonne in the September of last year. And I just want to read it to you because Macron, you love him, hate him, but he is a passionate European. And on that, I am shoulder to shoulder with him. And a part in the speech for making a case for saying, if we're going to fight refugees and tackle the immigration process, we in Europe have to start thinking of Marshall plans for Africa, Marshall plans for the Middle East. We have to help these countries stop being collapsing, but actually become functioning kind of democracies and economies so that people don't travel to us to the extent that they do. He wanted a common labor standards across the European Union. He wants Europe to be a kind of absolute fighter to tackle climate change. For all those good reasons and many, many more, we are shoulder to shoulder with this man and what he wants to do. We should be alongside him inside the European Union fighting for those changes. We should not be doing what we're doing, convulsed by this Brexit conversation, and not even begin to address the social and economic distress that provoked it. But here is what he said about Europe. The strongest cement that binds the European Union together will always be culture and knowledge. This Europe, where every European recognizes their destiny in the figures adorning a Greek temple or in Mona Lisa's smile. This Europe of cafes that Steiner described, this Europe that Suarez called a law, a spirit, a custom, this Europe of landscapes and folklores, this Europe of Erasmus, the continent's preceptor, who said 500 years ago that every young person should travel the continent to learn other languages and unlearn their boorish ways. This Europe, which has lived through so many wars and conflicts, what holds it together is its culture. Yeah, I find that inspiring. And that's what makes me a pro-European. I learnt it at my father's knee. My father landed in Normandy on D-Day 2, went straight to the front, fought the Battle of Caen, and was put in charge of a POW camp with all the tank crews that he'd been fighting so bitterly for the previous 4 or 5 weeks. And he told me, when he stood one side of the barbed wire and looked at the young men the other, that it was a matter of chance that he hadn't been born in Berlin or Dresden, and they hadn't been born in Carlisle. They were not Nazis. They were 18 and 19-year-olds caught up in a fearful European conflict. We shared the same values, my father told me. I learnt this on my father's knee. When subsequently we went abroad on holidays, he would always look out Germans of a similar age to him who he thought might have been soldiers and shake them by the hand and say, never, ever again. And he made me and my brother talk in our pidgin German to that man's family. And there we are. We do share the same values. A belief in democracy, the rule of law, freedom of the press, science, the European culture of which Macron spoke. That is why I want to stay in the European Union. I want to make common cause with my fellow Europeans in shaping the 21st century, its risks, exploiting its opportunities, and making my own country greater thereby. We must have a second people's vote. We must win it. When we've won it, we must build a Britain of which we're proud and never run this risk again. Thank you very much.